Hello. In this video, I'd like to show you some advanced tips and tricks on how to use Moog's Mariana. This is going to be a kind of fast orientation and like deeper tips and tricks, things that you might miss if you're not paying attention. I'm very honoured that Moog hired me to make a video about Mariana because it's a bonkers synth. It's also quite weird. It's not like a lot of other synths in terms of its layout, and that's in spite of the fact that it uses quite like common building blocks. So I think it really helps to go through it. So let's go through it. First things first, an Init patch. Go up here to get to the preset browser. And if you click on the hamburger, that's literally what it's called, a hamburger, you go Init presets. And now, there you have it. Now, Mariana is mostly monophonic. I say mostly because you can make it duophonic if you go to the little cog in the corner and enable duophonic mode. It's not playing every other note. And that's because if you go to the output section, we'll get to this, I've muted part 2. And basically, Mariana is a dual synth. There are 2 complete synthesizers in here. And in the duophonic mode, you alternate between them. And in non-duophonic mode, you use them to layer. So there's a lesson that Mariana can teach the advanced synthesist and the not advanced synthesis, because this is something that I just don't do, and you should. And it's using multiple synths at the same time to make more complex sounds. The Yamaha CS80 has like a dual layer architecture, and so does Mariana. There are 2 complete synths, synth 1 with a control page, synth 2 with a control page, and then the output stage. Now you could obviously use like a MIDI controller and have 2 synths and assign them to the same, MIDI channel, or you could have 2 plugins and control them both at the same time. I think there's a lesson to be learned here. But the function of having 2 independent synths in Mariana allows you to make just colossally huge sounds. And you can spread the stereo, literally pan the complete synths left and right, or you can have them both in mono and layer them over. So for example, like if I come into the filter here, come to the top, filter, engage favorites. I've got this zombie horror favorite. I'll show you how to get favorites in a sec. And in zombie horror, here's like that's one layer. That is layer 2. And layer 1 is doing a weird effect. So you can devote the entire synth, one whole synth engine to doing a weird effect, and the other to doing like bass reinforcement underneath that effect. So this layering concept is really powerful. And also, if you come up in here, no, it's here, in the hamburger again, you can copy synth 1 to 2 and 2 to 1, and you can swap their locations. So for example, if you were building a sound from scratch, you could make a sort of basic component and then copy it from one to the other, and then work on that copy with them both layered, or do some weird stereo thing. For example, you would make a sound in the synth 1, pan it hard left, alter it slightly timbrally, and then pan it hard right. And you'd have this insane 6 oscillator like mega sound. By the way, with the filtration, you click in this space here to favorite sounds, quite useful as you work through things. And note also, it's just one of those things, you might not like notice it, but you can filter on tags. You should tag sounds that you make to make them easier to find later. By the way, one navigational thing that I forgot to mention is because you've got all of these layers, you do quite a bit of paging on this thing. Above QWERTY on your keyboard is keys 1, 2, 9, and 0. If you push 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, you will page through the synth. So you can have your left hand on the keyboard, your right hand on the mouse, and then like foot controls, right? Like you've got a Taurus. But yeah, 1, 2, 9 is like a fast way of paging through the interface. Really useful. 1, 3, 1, 3 to move through the synth blocks or move through the control blocks or what have you. What a great suggestion. Whichever of the beta testers suggested that. So, Init, the preset. here is the basic thing. And let's just do a very quick sound, like super fast sound design. We'll just go through the kind of core gotchas with the sound engine. So it's dual oscillator. That's 2 oscillators. Here's a gotcha. Oscillator level 7 here. 7 is like unity, and it drives beyond 7. So it's based on the CP3 concept, like the CP3 mixer from the Moog modulars. If you wang up the levels, it will be more driven. And you'll hear differences in how the resonance responds. I recently did a podcast with Daniel Van Tine from Intelligent, and I'd really recommend that you listen to that podcast for more on that concept of how resonance is affected by input level. All right, 2 oscillators. We can detune oscillator 2, and we have frequency control that controls 1 and 2. And you might ask, why can I offset the frequency of oscillator 1 as well? Because that then makes C not a C. And the reason is because you have a sub oscillator, this frequency offset down here is saying -1 octave means it will always be 1 octave below what actual key you're playing. 1 octave below B. I know keys. C. But if you move it to -1 linked, then it will stay linked to this frequency, which is both oscillators. So just know that, like, you can basically create a 3 oscillator sound with one section where currently the sub will be doing C, but then we can blend in oscillator 1, detune it, and then we can have oscillator 2. 3 oscillator sound. Of course, we've got this layering concept, so Synth 2's got 3 oscillators to contribute, and so you can end up with this absolutely insane thing. And so we've got 2 oscillators with a sub-oscillator. We can change the wave shape for the both oscillators at the same time. You can't do them independently. You can only change them en masse. Another tip is if you have things in a weird position and you want to reset them, double click and it will reset. Also, go into the little cog here. If you go to configuration and go knob position highlight, you can add like a little groovy little white line to your knobs, which is quite useful. So you can choose multiple wave shapes. They change both oscillators at the same time. But a very cool thing, you can duty cycle change all of the wave shapes. And so making modulation, I feel I should kind of point that out. If you right-click a control, right-click it, you get the list of things that you can send into Synth 1's duty cycle. Synth 1, because we're on Synth 1, duty cycle, because it's that. And so note that there's some very kind of weird and interesting things. Some of the key ones, though, velocity, for example, simple enough, which is... So depending on how hard I hit a key is how or where the duty cycle is. So the velocity, how hard you hit the keyboard, becomes that. Very cool to do the same thing on Cutoff, of course, as well. You can see here you've got the direct amount, which is controlling how the range of movement that modulation actually performs. So on duty cycle, it's actually quite a lot, perhaps too much. So I might want to edit that. And that's done with the little sigma 0. And what this little sigma in the corner is going to show you a summary of all the modulations that you have. So over here is when you've clicked a knob and you can see the places you can send it. The sigma is your kind of list. This is all the things that you have things mapped to. And it's really useful if you're like, oh, I want to rein it in. I've overdone it, you know, or remove certain modulation. That's where you can do it here. So for example, I might want to remove it from the, this is a bit bonkers. Also, the velocity scaling on my key step is kind of extreme at the moment. It becomes really important that you've scaled your keyboard's velocity sensitivity well. You can actually change that for the key step. You can change that. However, you can also scale things and offset them using the function setting here. And the other thing that's really cool is you can also put other controls in the path of that modulation. So to use a modular analogy, this is like having VCAs that control modulation and controlling that VCA with an LFO. But for example, if I was to, let's do aftertouch. So if I click on the cutoff and I map it to pressure, happy days. And then, for example, I also wanted some vibrato. Then the vibrato, I'd do frequency, actually, because it's going to do both of the oscillators for me, both 1 and 2. I'd map it to LFO1. I'd enable it. Way too much. But I want to do Evangelis, because you always should. And that means that I want pressure to control the amount that LFO is going to the frequency. So you'd come in here and you'd go pressure. And you turn this up and notice how suddenly the influence falls away. So you do that, it's influencing that. No, it's not. But how do you like them apples? Vangelis likes those apples. That one's a bit extreme. You can still click on it and just rein that in. So like you can build these super expressive things, and you should dig into some of these things because they include MPE. MPE, for those of you who have MPE enabled controllers, this responds to them. What else? There's loads of things, but I suppose a couple of like just not obvious things I had to have pointed out to me is that the page for Synth 2's controls and Synth 1's, well, you can map them to either voice. So for example, you could have a voice that was just made from Synth 1, but you could use up all pages of Control 1 and Control 2 to modulate it extensively. And then as a further kind of modulation point here is you could have modulators that modulate modulators. So for example, you could click on LFO1 and you can have it be modulated by LFO2. And then I could have LFO1's output modulating the filter. So like this. All a bit extreme, isn't it? So I go to my little Sigma, I go control of LFO2 read. Do you see? So the LFO2 is controlling LFO1, while pressure is controlling the cutoff of the filter, but it's also being influenced by LFO2. And then you could go a little bit more hog wild with this, and you could do things like, for example, use the Modwheel. That's a really, I don't think I actually applied that correctly. Just like that. So now when I turn up the Modwheel, that applies the modulation of one oscillator, one LFO to the other. It's really important to dig into this. This is super cool. You could have it so that the Modwheel does all kinds of stuff, and you could literally just direct map stuff. So for example, if I want like mixer levels to be controlled by the Modwheel, right click, there's Modwheel, enable. And then I need to drop the oscillator to level. Turn off hard sync. See? That's really, really powerful. You can build these expressive patches that use these little controls that you just have at your fingertips, and you can make cool things out of them. Yeah. Now, I should mention the CV section up here, which is a way of interconnecting the control between instances of Mariana and of the Moog Mogafoga plugins. So I've got another instance of Mariana here, and I can literally find it. So this one is HXSX. And if I come over here, this little sound is another Mariana. And this one, CV, is P at FD. And if I go C it be in, I can take CV from P at FD here. So like LFO2, for example. Control voltage out. So it will be Synth 1, LFO2. So now synth 1 LFO2 comes into this instance. What should we do? Right click this, CV1. There it is. So that is the LFO from this instance, controlling something that is happening in this instance. Really cool. If you just want like more modulation, you can just fire up another instance. But you can also, like the most sort of groovy and spiritual version of this is you can have tracks made from multiple instances where all your Marianas are sort of symbiotic, like the qualities and timbral changes that are being affected by the LFOs and the envelopes in one instance can be heard in other ways, shapes and forms in other instances of Mariana. Or if you have the Moog plugins, you can CV connect with those too. So you could use like the cluster flux and use its LFOs in your instance of Mariana, or you could be using the Moog to affect Mariana, and then like they're like talking to each other. Everything is all singing from the same sort of spiritual control voltage hymn sheet. Food for thought. So let's do some kind of weird stereo stuff that Mariana is particularly suited for. And we can talk around some of the like nuances of the voice. And like one of the things is that we might want to spread the stereo. We can do that by going in the output and spreading one voice left and one voice right. Double click them to return that. Or I can spread oscillator 1 to the left and 2 to the right with this. So if you turn them both up, and let's crank them. Let's have a bit of modulation and let's slow her right down. Nice. So this dual off spread, it controls how voices are spread left and right. The accent button is a thing where if you play the velocity of the keyboard above 96, velocity level 96, then it will drive harder the envelopes into the output. By the way, this legato mode thing, if I hold a note down like this, every time I re-trigger, it's going to re-trigger the envelopes. But if you push legato, it's not. And then what add does is subtle but really important. Basically, when you re-trigger the envelopes, instead of resetting them to the very beginning every time they re-trigger, they'll re-trigger from the position they were just at. Versus do you hear how the filter like hops up and hops down on add? It's actually quite cool. It's a nice little thing to have. So these things are all really subtle, and then so we can spread the voices left and right. That is the oscillators, sorry. You can spread the oscillators left and right. But there is this crossover section here. And what that's doing is that's creating an extra high pass and low pass filter that will high pass the oscillator section and make space for the sub oscillator and actually be low passed as well. And this is really important for a few reasons. So here's a slightly more driven version of the sound. And that was using the saturation on synth 1 and 2. Although actually I'm not even sure, synth 2 isn't on. So this is just one synth. But if we turn on crossover, it's not just fading between VCO and sub. It's actually a high pass and low pass together that is a crossover, and it's carving out space for each of them. So the dual oscillator have their own space to live in the upper section, and the sub has its own space to live in the lower. And a really important thing here is that the sub is in mono. and the dual oscillator currently is in stereo. And so if you are very fortunate and going to be mastering to vinyl, and you want your bass sound to not cause the needle to jump out of the record because it's in stereo, then you might want to use the crossover, because it's effectively going to do that. It's going to keep the sub in mono at the bottom end and kind of just leave the upper end to be stereo. Now, you can pan left and right, so do bear that in mind. So you could be panning your sub in stereo as well, but you know for a fact that there is the Ableton utility that you can mono the lower end, and you could just have it mastered for vinyl. But I think it's still an important control because that also carves space. There's this thing that I think I'm pretty confident people are going to say, which is it sounds so big, it sounds massive, that it may eat up all of the frequency spectrum that you have available. And there is truth to that. It can absolutely make sounds that do completely eat up the whole frequency spectrum, but only if you program it that way. You have a low pass and a high pass that you can run in series, so you can band pass this, and you can also high pass the sub and make more controlled sounds. You can also do this kind of thing, which is to say that you've got this insanely scooped sound where you've got high frequency energy just to it will help with translation because you're basically adding a bit of high frequency detail to your bass in order so that played on systems where you don't really hear it, the little high frequency clues, they cue people in that there's bass happening, if that makes sense. Obviously, you can also saturate the thing in order to get similar kinds of effects where you kind of add harmonics and make things that are otherwise very subby more audible. Oh, I've got add on. Do you see what I mean? So you can carve out the frequency spectrum however you want, but suffice to say, it will carve out the frequency spectrum. It sounds vast. It's shocking how vast it sounds, in fact. Really like this sound. This is done through compounding filters, which is to say putting them in serial and having it so that they are both doing interesting things within a frequency spectrum that is where the human vocal cords operate. And if we come to the Sigma, we can kind of see, interestingly, they've used the random voltage generators here to do stuff. I think it's worth highlighting them. The random voltage generators are very cool. And obviously you can modulate everything. And as you well know, you can modulate, everything in Synth 1 with Control 1 and Control 2. And I think it's there are certain things that are just so worth worth modulating. If I get a little ARP going on. Oof. Come to Control 1 and get this little bad boy going with sync on. And then sync it to 16ths. If you come to these little wiggles, you can choose where it goes to, by the way. So I want new destination, and then it shows you places. Oh, that's a good one, isn't it? Yeah, it is a good one. And then come to the output, we've got a delay. Put it in ping pong mode, sync it to the tempo. And then we've got our 3 forms of drive. And then let's come up to the hamburger, copy 1 to 2. We don't really need ping pong anymore because we're doing it the expensive way. But we have got chorus. Whoa. And then if we come across here, Are our two LFOs in perfect sync with each other? Don't want that. So I might want to come and adjust the phase of the LFOs so they're doing different things, they're in different positions. Whoa. There are different modes. Perlin is like a sort of fluctuating voltage. And maybe I'll use Perlin on like a timbral control. Let's hard sync this. And then we're going to use Perlin noise to modulate. To modulate the D-tune. And then, as I promised earlier, I could actually be modulating both of the synths D-tune. I can't mess with the low-pass filter of both of them at the same time, except I can. Oh my goodness gracious, gravy and whiskers, that sounds good. Whoa. Because I could come over here, right-click, and go Modwheel, my friend. So now I'm going to go synth 1, synth 2, also the Modwheel. Yes. And I'm going to scale it, because do you see that this isn't going to scale the entire range? So the scale can help us increase it. Come to the Sigma. Scale that one as well. Scaled it way too much. With it at the top, you don't have to do it much. But by holding the control at its full extent, so now the Modwheel is my overall master cutoff of both synths. Woof. Another thing that you should modulate. Always modulate your amp envelopes, my friends. I'm going to do it with random 1. And I'm going to drop it. Flippin' heck. Yes, you. I want you to be modulated by random 1. Sick. So modulate the release times of your envelopes. It's an excellent, excellent time. That's wicked. In here, I think we've kind of covered it, except to say that correlation is an important one. Just as we were talking earlier about the whole like crossover thing, note. Interesting. You can actually just use that as a high pass if you have the subfilter off. Correlation of 1 means that things are in phase. If it's 0, then things are not in phase. So if for whatever reason, see when I put them centered like that, it becomes they're more in phase with each other. But basically, if it says 1, then you're okay. That, not okay. Sounds amazing, but if I sum it to mono, I think the synth will disappear. Utilities. I mean, it's kind of there. But it's weird. Just bear that in mind. The correlation is there to say if it's 1, then you're good. Because most club systems are mono. So it really matters how your banging Mariana bass track will sum to mono, because it may well be sum to mono. A correlation of 1 means that you are okay. But a correlation of 0 means that when the things sum together, you may well lose information. And at worst, you completely lose your sound. But, you know, Mariana's oscillators do free run unless you use key reset. And so they will kind of phase and do interesting things to each other. But bear that in mind. By the way, you can also click this and just see left and right output volumes. There is a compressor here, interestingly, which you can use to rein things in and add punch if you so desire. It is very easy to make this thing howl and scream. Like, it's got quite an aggressive resonant filter, more aggro than a lot of like hardware Moogs that I've tried. So therefore you might want to use the compressor to help like make things more coherent, give yourself a safety net in case you blow everything out. If you have tips and tricks, things that you've discovered that you think should be shared with the class, please leave them as a comment. I really appreciate that. It's cool to help. I'm glad to do a video that just sort of talks about features and like how to use this. I'll leave you with a little tune I've been making, and I'll say thank you. Links below to things. Leave a comment if you've got some tips or thoughts.